My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Nathaniel Sheidley and Matthew Wilding, both of whom are associated with Revolutionary Spaces, the organization charged with overseeing the Old South Meeting House and the Old State House as both landmarks and museums, as well as gathering spaces for the open exchange of ideas and continuing practice of democracy. Nat serves as the president and CEO, and Matt is the Director of Interpretation and Education. In addition to telling us all about Revolutionary Spaces, Nat and Matt are here today to inform us about the very engaging, informative, and thought-provoking exhibit entitled Impassioned Destruction: Politics, Vandalism, and the Boston Tea Party. During the program, we'll find out why and how this exhibit, which commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, came about. And we'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour. In the process, we'll come to better understand and appreciate what transpired both during the Boston Tea Party, as well as several other confrontations throughout our country's history. Together, they all ask us as visitors to ponder the question, when, if ever, do you believe it's justified to destroy property in the name of a cause? Let's start by meeting our guest and then hearing all about Revolutionary Spaces and Impassioned Destruction: Politics, Vandalism, and the Boston Tea Party. Welcome. So delighted you're both able to be here.
Thanks so much, Jay. It's great to be here with you. And as a former Newton resident, I'm particularly glad to be here on this show.
Terrific, terrific. A couple of weeks ago, I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the Old State House, tour the Impassioned Destruction exhibit, learned a lot, eager to hear more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I also think it would be of interest if each of you would very briefly share a little bit about your backgrounds and what attracted you to Revolutionary Spaces. Nat, would you please begin?
Sure. I'm the president and CEO of Revolutionary Spaces, but before that, I was a curator at the Old State House. And before that, I was an academic. I spent 10 years teaching early American history and Native American history at Wellesley College. I actually followed some of my students into the field of public history. And what fascinates me about it is really just the opportunity to touch audiences at a very teachable moment when they come to our site seeking something and they don't know what. We get them for a short time, but there's a real opportunity to open their eyes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Matt, a few words about yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Matt Wilding. I'm the Director of Interpretation and Education at Revolutionary Spaces. I've been here for about 3 years. Came on board in July of 2020. Previous to that, I have served in various education and museum capacities at the Peabody Essex Museum and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute of the United States Senate and the Freedom Trail Foundation. I came to Revolutionary Spaces in part actually because I've known Nat for 10 or 15 years. We kind of came into the Freedom Trail orbit at about the same time. And I was always just impressed with his vision about how we could do more in historic sites in downtown Boston than just dress like colonists, which is what I was doing when I met him. And so I was thrilled to join the party in 2020.
Terrific, terrific. Well, let's start, please, Nat, if you could, and just share a little history and the mission of Revolutionary Spaces.
Sure. Revolutionary Spaces is actually, it's a very young organization. We sometimes think of it as a 300-year-old startup, but we launched in January of 2020, right before the pandemic, not knowing that that was coming. It was born through the merger of two of Boston's oldest and most storied historical organizations, the Bostonian Society, which was created in the 1880s, to care for the Old State House and interpret it, and the Old South Association in Boston, which was formed actually just a few years earlier in the 1870s, in order to oversee Old South Meeting House. And both organizations were born through the effort to preserve those buildings, which were threatened during the 19th century. And the reason that the two organizations came together was that we really saw an opportunity to tell a bigger story, and one that connected in more direct and relevant ways to the issues that we grapple with today. So the Old State House was the seat of government, where elected officials and appointed officials did the work of governing. And Old South Meeting House was built in 1729 as the home for Boston's third church. So it was sort of a community space, but it was built as the largest indoor gathering space in Boston, and it remained that through the Revolutionary period. So during that period when mass crowds were turning out to consider how to resist the measures being handed down by the ministry in London or by Parliament, they often found themselves too large in number to fit into other spaces like Faneuil Hall, and they go to Old South Meeting House. So it's best known as the place where the events leading up to the Tea Party took place, all of the town meetings with 5,000 people crammed into this little tiny space. And I think the idea was that by telling a single story across those two sites, we could really capture the core of what happened during the Revolutionary period, which was really that tension between those demanding that their voices be heard and those in power trying to figure out how to address those voices and what they were asking for. We think of our spaces as the spaces where some of our foundational questions took shape during those years. Most importantly, how are we represented, right? How is my voice heard? And what's my recourse when my voice isn't heard? And those questions are still so central to our public discourse and to the challenges facing our political system today, that really we've taken it as our mission, not just to help people understand the past in a deeper and fuller way, but to relate that past to our present. So open history, enter democracy is really our charter, right? We want to gather people in our spaces to feel transported by being in a place where the work of sustaining a free society began, but we want to encourage them to lean in because that work isn't finished. It wasn't finished by the revolutionary generation. We know by looking at what's going on all around us today that it's still work that is unfinished. And all of our exhibits and our programs are about inviting people to see how they can step into the story and write the next chapter.
Yeah, I have to say that mission that you summarized is what's so appealing about revolutionary spaces, the connection to historical understanding, and nothing brings that home more so than the current exhibition, Impassioned Destruction, and how that makes us consider things and events that are happening to this day. So with that said, let's move on. Matt, and could you just share a little bit about how and why Impassioned Destruction came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Impassioned Destruction in a lot of ways is the first large-scale manifestation of the mission that we tried to put into an exhibit form, right? It connects a major historical event and anniversary that's connected to one of our sites, the Old South Meeting House, as well as legally the Old State House. And it tries to connect it narratively to things that were literally happening as we were developing the exhibit. And in fact, as we were brainstorming the exhibit, the kind of creation of the idea of the exhibit was that I was tasked with coming up with a new exhibit for the Boston Tea Party, and was sitting, as many people were, in my house in January of 2021, watching the historical event of January 6th unfold. And it really made me reconsider a lot of the ways I felt about other historic events and how they were talked about. Right? So the Boston Tea Party and the Stamp Act riots of 1765 are pretty core historical events in the kind of Freedom Trail atmosphere in Boston. And I actually portrayed the leader of the Stamp Act riots for years on the Freedom Trail as a tour guide, Ebenezer McIntosh. And I always portrayed him as kind of a heroic figure, you know, and I thought of him as a great American figure. But watching a real live riot unfold in real time made me really reconsider the way I talked about the Stamp Act riot and the way I talked about the Boston Tea Party. So ultimately, the question that we're trying to pose to people, we're not trying to, you know, make any broad statements about any of the other historic events that we're depicting in this exhibit. We're just juxtaposing them next to the Boston Tea Party and asking visitors, well, how do you feel about the Boston Tea Party if you know that the Boston Tea Party was not well received at the time that it happened? And how do you feel about these other events in relationship to the Boston Tea Party, which has a very similar criteria of a protest in which people who perceive themselves to be slighted by some power go and destroy property because they feel as if they don't have any other recourse.
With that as a background, could you just share a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through in creating, designing the final exhibit that we can enjoy today?
Yeah, so we have a number of partners that we work with on this exhibit. Helen Regal from Her Design was the graphic designer, and Will Twombly from Spokeshave Design did the layout, essentially the layout design. He actually built that dock that you see there and that tea crate. The illustrator's name throughout the exhibit is a man named Jeremiah Scheik, who is a comic book illustrator who I've worked with previously. And the way we talked about the design for this exhibit was that we wanted it to encapture these historic events, but we didn't want it to feel like it was kind of a traditional 18th century historic exhibit where, you know, everything looks like parchment paper and there's cursive script. We instead wanted it to feel modern and alive and relevant. And specifically, the direction we gave was we wanted it to feel urgent, almost alarmist. So you see the color orange in particular throughout the exhibit, because we wanted you to feel like this is a crisis. And I think that Helen in particular did a fantastic job with that. The development of the content of the exhibit was pretty different. That was done predominantly internally by myself and my fantastic exhibits and education team. We essentially, after we came up with this structure of going over the Boston Tea Party as a thing that was controversial in the 1770s, we then decided to juxtapose it not just to January 6th, but to other historic events from a broad range of period and political outlook. So there's conservative and liberal protests, there's labor protests, there's an anti-Catholic protest. There's a variety of things in here, but they all had the same criteria, which was that it had to be a protest that was organized by people who felt as if they were not being heard, whose specific objective was to destroy property, and specifically not to kill people. That is not to say that nobody died in any of these instances, and some of them they did, but it does not appear to have been the objective of the protesters. And then we essentially just made a pool of all of these different instances we could find throughout American history where that criteria was met. And then we selectively, for the purposes of covering as much history as time as possible and as many points of view as possible, we selected the historic events that we selected. And you're on this question that's posed actually 3 times throughout the exhibit. Do you believe the participants of the Boston Tea Party were justified in destroying the tea in December 16th, 1773? This is really the core of the interactive nature of the exhibit. You're asked this question as soon as you walk into the exhibit. You're asked cold how you feel about this, and then you go through this history of the Boston Tea Party as it unfolds. Tea being brought into Boston Harbor with a tax attached to it that the people of Boston organized against. and then the government refusing to send the tea back, and that culminating at a meeting at the Old South Meeting House, which prompts the destruction of the tea by throwing it into the harbor. And then we introduce a part of the narrative that most people don't know, which is that the immediate response to the destruction of the tea was incredibly negative. Most people opposed it. People like George Washington and Ben Franklin publicly denounce it. And it isn't until the 19th century, particularly specifically the 1830s, that we essentially rebrand the destruction of the tea as the Boston Tea Party, and we make commemorative materials, and we find survivors like George Robert Twelves Hughes, and we march them around town in their colonial clothing, and we make heroes out of these people. And we then create this myth that sustains our justification today of our being a nation founded on revolution because of actions like this. And then we ask the same question again with the exact same interactive. And then we introduce the Stamp Act riot of 1765, where Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house is destroyed, the Ursuline Convent fire, which specifically evokes the Boston Tea Party in burning down a Catholic convent over false pretenses about abduction of women and forcing them into nunneries. A labor dispute in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1877, the Reading Railroad strike. We also highlight wow, lost my train of thought for a second. The Gulf Tower bombing by the radical leftist group, the Weather Underground, in the 1970s. And we finished the exhibit with January 6th. And then after that, we have a big wall, the graffiti wall, where people can kind of sound off, because we expected this would evoke some feelings. But the last thing you do in the exhibit is you're confronted with this question again: do you believe the participants of the Boston Tea Party were justified? And what we found is certainly the majority of people believe that they're justified when they start, and they remain that way when they're finished. But it does change. Some people change their opinions throughout the exhibit. We expected that to be the case. I think one of the things that I didn't expect is how many people, when they walked in, would say no, that the folks weren't justified. And in some cases, those people are the folks who changed their vote to yes.
You know, as we make our way through and we see some of the other mass destructions that you mentioned, one of the things I really appreciated throughout was the same sort of skeleton structure that you gave in describing them. Yeah. You would talk about an incident, and then the immediate aftermath, and then long-term consequences. That really helped me as a visitor sort of tie things together and be able to make some comparisons.
Yeah, it was a really important part of the design process, actually. So, you know, truth be told, most of my work previous to this exhibit was on immersive game-based education and film-based interpretation. I did a lot of that at the Kennedy Institute of the United States Senate. I did a film here at Revolutionary Spaces. I've done games at a variety of places. So we did another exhibit a couple of months previous to this, which was much smaller in scale, which is also still on display on the use of petitions to have your voice heard. And while I think it's a very good exhibit that highlights a lot of really interesting points of view in the 18th century, I really felt like I wanted to make sure that we were hitting as tightly as possible the message we were trying to hit in this new exhibit. So we came up with a very specific general overview, specifics of the incident, immediate aftermath, and then long-term consequences structure, so that we could make sure that folks who weren't familiar with these subjects could follow them. And I think I'm glad to hear that you had a positive response to it, because I think it worked. And you know, it lends itself to a broader design issue with exhibits, which is that we have a lot to say, and as professionals, we want to tell all day. We want to tell the story, right? But the general visitor doesn't have a ton of time to lend to each single section of the exhibit. So we can give them as tight an overview as possible, and then have talented and knowledgeable staff in our galleries to extrapolate if people want to dig in and drill down. That allows every type of visitor to have have a good experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Nat, as visitors make their way through, in addition to enjoying, learning from, appreciating the design and some of the other features that Matt mentioned, could you just briefly mention some of the incredible artifacts that you can encounter?
Well, I think Matt is probably better positioned to share what the object list looks like. But I mean, there are some real treasures from our collection in here relating to the Revolutionary period, but also to later periods, including the Ursuline Convent fire. We have a painting that directly bears on that in our collection. And then, for some of the later events, it really was a question of either acquiring objects, in the case of January 6th, that could help us tell the story of very recent events, or borrowing objects from institutions that collect in those areas that we don't. So Matt got to play courier and actually had to drive down to Pennsylvania to pick up some of the objects on loan that relate to the Reading Railroad strike. But it is the objects are certainly a key feature of the exhibit.
The objects in this exhibit are great. Our collection is fantastic, particularly in relation to 18th and early 19th century issues. We have both documents and objects directly related to the Boston Tea Party. We have a tea caddy that one sort of anti-Tea Party, later Patriot figure's wife actually dumped his tea into the harbor in solidarity with the quote unquote Tea Partiers. We have a fantastic portrait of George Robert Twelves Hughes called the Centurion that is often referenced because it appears to be the person who is most closely associated with the celebration of the Boston Tea Party in the 19th century. We have pieces of Thomas Hutchinson's house and personal effects from when they destroyed his house in 1765. I want to call out the Berks History Center in Pennsylvania for lending us what I think are probably some of the most powerful objects in the exhibit. They lent us both a gun and a club that were held by the militia that attacked the protesters in the Reading Railroad strike of 1877. That led to the death of over a dozen people, and ultimately to the dissolving of that militia in Pennsylvania. But this is an attack where more people die than in the Boston Massacre, and the laborers who are organizing for better working conditions and the end of blacklists and things like that, issues again we're still dealing with right now. They specifically evoke the American Revolution and the ideas of the revolutionary generation. And they speak about the American government and the Pennsylvania government as if it's a colonizer that's oppressing them.
Terrific, terrific. Well, there's much more we could talk about, but I think you've provided a wonderful overview, some specifics to entice people to definitely make their way to downtown Boston to experience it themselves. In the 5 minutes or so remaining, Nat, would you please share, in addition to this terrific exhibit, some of the other programs, events, and other opportunities that Revolutionary Spaces provides the general public?
Sure. And Jay, I think maybe I would break this into two categories: things that we just always do, and then upcoming opportunities that relate specifically to this special year where we're commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party. But we're open every day except for 3 days of the year, and visitors who come into our sites can see exhibits at both Old South Meeting House and the Old State House. They can hear our fantastic visitor experience staff giving talks that tell a little bit about the history of our spaces and open them up around particular topics. We have a fantastic talk that is about the history of slavery in revolutionary Boston and the struggle to bring an end to slavery. There are also a couple of indoor-outdoor walking tours. One that is uses the Boston Massacre as a point of departure and thinks about how that story has been remembered and how our memory of it has changed over time, called Massacre in Memory. And then we do a tour called Beyond the Revolution, which explores other aspects of the history of the downtown neighborhood and Boston through the long period of time that the city has existed. So there's great opportunities, and also for students who are part of a class that might come in. There's all kinds of opportunities for immersive school programs, and we're certainly building a group of teachers who are both excited about what we're doing now and also eager to work with us to build new opportunities to connect with the programming that they're doing in their own classrooms. And then, we're doing a lot this year around the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party. This is a really important moment, I think, for our country to reflect on what the Tea Party means to us today. It's also more or less the kickoff nationally for the cycle of commemorations that will culminate in 2026 as we remember the 250th anniversary of independence. So we've thought about how to do this work partly with an eye to setting a model for the work of others. So we're really focused not just on programs that bring people in and allow them to sort of recreate the past, but that connect it to the issues that matter to us today. So we just wrapped up actually a 2-day outdoor music festival in downtown Boston called Raising Voices that explores just the long tradition of American protest and the role that music and art have played in expressing our own ambitions and goals for seeing change in our country and in our communities. Coming up in November, we're mounting a play called Phyllis in Boston, which is in part about the Tea Party, but it's really about Phyllis Wheatley, the African-American poet who was a member of our congregation, came to Boston as an enslaved girl in when she was just 7 years old and literally wrote her way to freedom. The first published copies of her poems were on board the Dartmouth, which was one of the 3 ships carrying tea into Boston Harbor in November of 1773. And so this play is an opportunity for us to reflect on the fact that there were multiple struggles for freedom underway in Boston during the 1770s, not just the one that we most remember and are most familiar with, but also a struggle by those in bondage and their allies to bring an end to slavery. That particular struggle does not reach a successful culmination during the years of the Revolution. And in fact, in many ways, the struggles that we have today are about the long legacy of the institution of slavery. So this is an opportunity to reflect on how those collided in the 1770s, and it'll be a 5-week run running throughout November and into December. Then we're having a civic event where we can gather together and think about who the change makers are in our community today. That'll be on December 14th. And then on the big day, December 16th, the actual 250th anniversary of the Tea Party, we're collaborating with the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum, with Revolution 250, and with others to mount a huge reenactment of the events that led to the destruction of the tea.
Fabulous, fabulous, very exciting. Well, as a former teacher who was familiar with offerings at both the Old State House and Old South Meeting House, you, Matt, and others at Revolutionary Spaces have really stepped up the quality and the engagement opportunities of the programming, and definitely look forward to participating in some of the events and programs that you just outlined for us. And very briefly, I know we'll have it in the credits, Nat, how can people stay informed about Revolutionary Spaces?
Well, they can go to our website, revolutionaryspaces.org. And we also encourage people to become members so that they can receive a direct email with notices about everything that's coming up. And of course, we'd love for people to follow us on our social media channels across all various channels. I think our handle is consistently at RevSpaces.
Okay, terrific. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you both again for taking the time to be here. Look forward to visiting again and participating in some of the other opportunities. All the best with future endeavors.
Jay,
Thanks,
thanks
Jay.
so much.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.